It's time for us to check back in with a thread that runs so true. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Before I reached the second small opening near Laurel Ridge, I lost my path. I walked into a forest of tough-budded white oaks. They grew close together, shutting out the diminishing winter light. I had never seen these trees before. I turned quickly, retracing my steps until I found the path. I knew I'd been in too much of a hurry. I'd have to be more careful. I'd not walked more than 100 yards when a red fox, almost as big as a collie, crossed my path. When he saw me, he took off with full speed and disappeared into the wintry dusk that was getting thicker on the mountain. I wondered now if I had reached the black cloud that seemed to rest there. I wondered if that was why the dusk was suddenly turning to darkness. But why should I worry now? I had at least reached Laurel Ridge, for there was a 5-strand, rusty barbed wire fence nailed to the trees. I knew this fence. It followed Laurel Ridge some distance before it turned back down the mountain. When I held my arm up to look at my watch, I couldn't see the figures on the dial. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew it was early. I knew I was in the snow cloud, for the big snowflakes were falling around me. I could see them dimly. These white flakes about the size of dimes, falling just in front of my eyes. I could feel them hitting my overcoat. All I had to do was turn to my left after I reached Laurel Ridge. That was the right direction. I could follow the wire fence, even if I had to follow it with my hand as I walked. I had one free hand. I carried my suitcase with my right hand. My left hand was free. But I didn't touch the fence. Not yet. I was following Laurel Ridge Road. I was following it with my feet. I'd hunted much at night in my lifetime. Darkness had never bothered me too much. But now I couldn't see the woods, and I knew it couldn't possibly be 6 o'clock. I was in a snowstorm. I could hear the snowflakes falling through the barren oak tops whose branches interlocked above the road. Then I heard voices, and the sound was sweet to hear. I had barely time to sidestep for 2 mule teams. I almost walked into a mule before I saw him, yet there was a lighted lantern on the jolt wagon the mules were pulling. When I recognized Eve Potter's, he stopped his mule team in great surprise. He asked me where I was going on a night like this. Then I knew what he was talking about. The fury of the storm almost blotted out the lantern light. It didn't give light more than 6 feet away. The snowflakes were larger than nickels. They were almost as large as quarters. I was in the cloud I'd seen before I left Baylor's. I told Eve Potter's and his son Zeke, who was sitting on the wagon beside him, I was on my way home. That snow wasn't falling down in Tiber Valley when I left, not more than 2 hours ago. He told me they hadn't been in the snowstorm until they reached the top of Raccoon Hill. Then he invited me to get on the wagon and go home with them, but I refused. When I refused, he said he would loan me his lantern, but that they couldn't get around Laurel Ridge without it. Said he had 5 more miles to go, that he had taken a load of tobacco to Lansboro and was getting back the same day, that he and his mules were very tired to push through 5 more miles of darkness and storm. On this lonely ridge, high up in a snow cloud, I said goodnight to Eve and Zeke and was on my way, for I had lost about 5 minutes talking to them. I hadn't walked but a few steps when I looked back. The mule teams, wagon, riders, and lantern had disappeared in the storm. Yet I heard the jingling of the mule's harness, and I heard the men's voices as they talked to each other. Then I plunged on, alone, taking in both sides of the road. I hunted for the fence with an outstretched hand in the darkness, but I couldn't find it. Eve had warned me about one place. He told me if I bore too far to my left, I would go into a vast tract of timber that lay on the east wall of Tiber Valley. And for this reason, I bore to my right, feeling with my feet while the snow came down as I had never felt it fall before. One thing I'd forgotten to ask Eve for was matches. He was a pipe smoker, too. He had smoked his pipe all the time he sat on the wagon and talked to me. If only I had a match. I was stumbling over the road. Once I went in water to my knee. Then I knew I must be on the Laurel Ridge Road. This was a deep wagon wheel rut, and Eve had driven over it and had broken the thin ice down to the water. My foot was wet. Water squashed in my shoe. One of my galoshes was filled with water. Then I stepped into a hole of water with my dry foot. I went into my knee. Both pant legs were wet to my knees. Again and again I stepped into water, but my feet were already wet, and it didn't make any difference if I did get them wet again. I kept moving. I followed the road the best I could. I knew I was on the Laurel Ridge Road. That was the main thing. I would soon reach the turnpike at the top of Raccoon Hill. That was where the Laurel Ridge Road ended. And this distance was approximately 3 miles from where my path from Baylor's had gone through the barbed wire fence onto the Laurel Ridge. If I could only see my watch, I had surely walked 3 more miles. Time in the night, I thought, when one was walking alone, might seem longer than it actually was. I kept on going. I waded water and I waded snow. The snow was almost as deep as my galoshes were high. I walked on and on and on. Then I knew I'd gone far enough to reach the turnpike on Raccoon Hill, the turnpike that would take me straight to Lansboro. While I thought about the fast time I would be able to make on the turnpike when I reached it, I suddenly walked into a cornfield. I thought it was a cornfield. I thought I was standing beside a fodder shock. It stood like a white wigwam before me. I pushed my hand through the snow and felt the dry fodder stalks. I knew now that I was lost. I couldn't even retrace my steps. I couldn't see them. If it had been light enough for me to see them, I couldn't have followed them far because they would have been under snow. I was lost, that was all. I was in this cornfield and I would have to make the best of it. I stood beside the fodder shock, this tiny thing of security, while I screamed at the top of my voice. I knew that in this part of Greenwood County there was much wasteland. There were miles and miles where there wasn't a house, but I screamed anyway. I thought somebody might hear me and come to my rescue. The only answer I got was the faraway barking of a fox. When I screamed, he mocked me with his barking. When I had reached this fodder shock, my feet were still warm and my face was wet with perspiration. But in this open space where corn had grown on the mountaintop, there was an incessant sweep of wind. The wind carried the snow directly at me. I could measure the speed of the wind by the way the soft flakes hit my face. The soft flakes felt like grains of corn. I had to start walking to keep warm. I had to do something in a hurry. Then a thought came to me. If there was one fodder shock here, there were others. The cornfield must be fairly large to give the wind such great velocity. I was almost afraid to leave the fodder shock I had already found. Even when I did, I held to my suitcase. I walked a few paces and found another fodder shock. I put my arm around the top of the shock and dragged it back to the first one. I carried 8 fodder shocks to one place. The fodder shocks were not large. The shocks were not as tall as I was. I used one hand to carry them. I held to my suitcase with the other. I was afraid I'd lose it and that it would soon be snowed under. Besides, I had other ideas. After I had pulled these fodder shocks together, I laid the heavy ends of the fodder to the windward side of the mountain. I bedded 3 shocks down on the snow. Then I put a shock on each side of the floor I made. I stood 2 shocks up on the windward side to pull down on me as soon as I was ready to lie down. The last shock I stood up to use where the fodder would be thinnest above me. Then I stood on the fodder and pulled off my shoes. The wind-driven snow was cold to my wet feet and legs. I pulled off my overcoat and wet pants. I took a dry, soiled shirt from my suitcase and dried the water from my feet and legs. I tied dry, dirty shirts around my feet. I put on a pair of soiled trousers I was taking to have dry cleaned. I bundled myself with all the clothes I had in my suitcase. I lay down and spread my overcoat over me. Now I reached up and pulled the fodder shocks down upon me. The fodder quilt was thick, but not too heavy. I lay there and listened to the mice in the fodder around me and the ticking of my watch while over me the wind moaned and the snow fell. I knew that I should not go to sleep, for if I did, the wind might blow the fodder from over me. I would freeze to death, and I would not be found in this cornfield until the farmer came to haul his fodder home. I must have been half asleep when I heard the hoot owls start calling to one another from the timber all around this cornfield. I didn't know exactly where they were, but I knew they frequented the less populated places. From their calls coming from all directions, I knew this must be their meeting place. I no longer heard the wind, nor felt it seeping through the fodder. I parted the fodder stalks to see what had happened. There were 1,000,000 bright stars high in the clear blue sky and in a short distance all around me, for there was not more than 2 acres of this cornfield. I could see the dark outlines of trees. Among these trees were the hoot owls. They were on every side. They cried jubilantly to each other, asking always the same, "Who are you?" I pulled the fodder quilt back over me and lay there listening to the hoot owls, to the mice over me, around me, and through the fodder, and to the ticking of my watch. I thought that I could stay awake until morning. Since the skies had cleared, I knew the weather before morning would be subzero on this mountaintop. I went to sleep dreaming that I would not go to sleep. When I awoke, there were fewer stars in the sky. Daylight didn't come on these short December days until nearly 8. I tried to see what time it was, but I couldn't see the hands of my watch. The owls had flown away, and all was silent save for the ticking of my watch and the mice that had never slept the whole night through. I had slept warm on this cold night. I had warmed the fodder for the mice. The place was comfortable for all of us. But now I sat up and placed the fodder around me like a wigwam. I wanted the day to break so I could put on my clothes and be on my way. I had never been so hungry in my life. Just as soon as it was light enough to see what I was doing, I started dressing. The legs of the pants I pulled off were frozen stiff and hard. My shoes had frozen so that I couldn't get them on. I didn't have a match to build a fire to thaw them. It was impossible to put them on. I wrapped a soiled shirt around each foot. I put my feet into my frozen galoshes. I put my frozen shoes and pants into my suitcase. It was light enough for me to see dim footprints in the snow. I could retrace myself. I wanted to see where I had made my mistake. I followed my tracks, dim little prints in the crusted snow, for more than a mile. Then I came to Laurel Ridge. Far, far down below, I could see Hinton Valley, now a great white silence except for the dark, leafless, sleeping trees. And to my right, if I had gone just 50 feet to my left, I would have found the turnpike on Raccoon Hill. I had borne too far to my right after Eve Potters had warned me about turning left. I had gone somewhere on the mountain between the headwaters of North Fork and Raccoon, where I had found the cornfield and slept in the fodder. Though it was Saturday morning when farmers would be on their way to Lansboro, I was the first person on the turnpike. The white silence of snow that was even with the tops of my galoshes remained unbroken until I made a path. I walked down Raccoon Hill, and in the distance, somewhere far down the road, I heard voices. They were coming toward me. I was going toward them. Their shouts at their teams grew louder. I saw 3 teams hitched to the snowplow, and the county road workers were breaking the road. I walked past them, and they looked at me. I hadn't noticed the fodder blades still hanging to my overcoat, and I brushed them off before I stopped at Gullett's gristmill. I knew Ephraim Gullett. When I went inside the gristmill, he asked me if I wasn't traveling early. I told him I'd been lost and had slept on the mountain. He put more coal in the pot-bellied stove. He made a pot of coffee. I thawed my shoes and my pant legs while I drank hot coffee and warmed myself in front of the red-hot stove. Ephraim told me that his thermometer was 12 below at 6 that morning. He couldn't understand how I had stripped my clothes and dried the water from my legs and feet there on the mountaintop facing the great sweeps of snow-laden wind. He couldn't understand how I had managed to survive the rigor of the raw elements on the mountaintop when it was 12 below in the valley. When Superintendent Larry Anderson unlocked his office door at 9 that Saturday morning, I was there waiting for him. I had caught a ride in on a coal truck from Gullett's gristmill to Lansboro. Well, how did you get here so early?" Superintendent Anderson asked. "You didn't come all the way from Winston this morning." "Just part of the way," I said. He didn't ask me where I stayed, and I didn't tell him. I had something else I wanted to talk to him about. "How are you getting along with your school out there?" he asked me. "I think I'm getting along all right," I said. "What reports have you heard?" "Good reports," he said. "I'm glad to hear the reports about my teaching have been favorable," I said. "I am learning myself. My pupils are working me as hard as I'm working them." My superintendent thought I was joking. He started laughing, and he laughed until he couldn't talk. "I'm telling you the truth," I said. "I'm not telling you a joke. I've worked harder than I did in high school or in college." Superintendent Larry Anderson laughed harder than before. He laughed so loud anybody in the corridors of the courthouse could have heard him. "You know there's not anything as good for a man as a good life early in the morning," he said. I knew that he still thought I was joking. "Superintendent Anderson," I said seriously, "I'm up against teaching those 14 pupils. I've not got a slow one among them. I've got a couple of average pupils, and they can do every bit of work I give them. And," I explained with a gesture of my hand for emphasis, "I've got one pupil that's a genius. He knows more facts than I do. He's only a freshman in high school. I tell you, Budge Waters is a genius. If he isn't, I'm terribly dumb. I've got 6 or 7 A pupils, and he's above them." "Do you grade by the curve system?" he asked. "Certainly not," I said. "Why not?" he asked. "I didn't make a bad record in high school," I said. "I made better than B average in college. I have first-year high school pupils crowding me. They ask me intelligent questions I cannot answer. Why should I string pupils like this over a curve system? Not any more than I should take a poor pupil from a group of poor ones and give him an A because he is a fraction better than the others." Superintendent Larry Anderson sat silently looking at me for a minute. We were in his office alone. No other rural teachers had reached Lansboro. Then he spoke thoughtfully. "Well, what is your problem?" "I haven't any," I said. "I've not had to discipline a pupil. They work hard. They play hard." I knew he was wondering why I had come to his office. "But there is one thing I'd like to do," I said. "That's why I called on you this morning. I'd like to test my own judgment to see if I am wrong or right in my opinion of my pupils. I'd like to know how to go about entering them in the state scholastic contest. The contest is held each spring, isn't it?" "Oh, yes," he said, "but there isn't an elimination process. Your pupils will have to take an examination against the pupils in Lansboro High School. Then if you are successful there," he explained, "they'll go to Auckland to enter the district contest. If they're successful there, they'll go on to the state contest." I knew that to get past Lansboro, now a joint city and county high school, we'd have to compete with the best from nearly 400 pupils. To get past the regional, we'd have to compete with the best selected from thousands. Yet it took only one brain to win a contest. I knew Budge Waters had that brain if it was properly trained. I thought he was capable of competing statewide. I thought Billy Leonard could take the district in algebra, and I was willing to challenge Big Lansboro High School in all the 5 subjects I was teaching my pupils. "If it's all right with you, Superintendent," I said, "you make arrangements and set a date for us to meet Lansboro High School in algebra, Latin, English, plain geometry, and history." "I'll do it," he smiled. "Would sometime in January suit you?" "Any time's all right with me," I said. "Make it convenient for the Lansboro High School." "That's fair enough," he said. "This is all I wanted to see you about," I said. With these words, I left him alone in his office. We'll stop right there. What an exciting part. Well, that's what I told you last week, is we'd have to wait till this week to see if Jesse made it through the snowstorm. And he did, made it through, but my goodness, what a scary experience that had to be. I would have turned around. I would have definitely got on the jolt wagon there with Eve and Zeke, with the men that come along, the man and his son. I would have definitely said, "Yeah, I think I'll go home with you. Let me climb aboard." I wouldn't have stayed up there. Jesse was determined and maybe a little bit too stubborn for his own good. Seems like everybody trying to tell him that he should wait, or he shouldn't go out on a night like that. He should have listened to the Baylors, but he didn't listen to them. And Then he had that opportunity to get in the wagon. He didn't do that either. So then he ended up, in the cornfield with the fodder. It really interesting to me how he was so sure of himself, which, I think he was being foolish. I think he would even admit that now, that he was being foolish to do that in the snow. But one of the reasons he was so sure of himself, well, I guess two reasons. One was that he was, in those days, people walked. So he's told us in the previous reading he'd walked 35 miles in one day. That's a long way, 35 miles. So he knew that he could do that. So he believed in himself as far as his, I guess, his abilities, athletic ability, his health and vigor to be able to walk like that. I could not walk 35 miles, I'm sure. I mean, I know I couldn't. So he felt sure about that. But then the other thing was he just knew the roads. I mean, he knew those trails. He felt like he knew them so intimately that he'd be able to navigate them even in the snow. Now, that turned out to not be true in Jesse's case here, because of the snow did make it disorient him and cover things up, and it was coming down so hard he could barely see through it. He tells about the lantern. You could only see the light of the lantern maybe 6 feet around it, and the snow just, sucked up all that light. Something keeps jumping on my legs and biting me. I think it's just a fly. Anyway, but so he felt like he knew that the trails that he was going to go on so intimately, he didn't have to worry about it. And he even talks about how that he was used to hunting at night. He would go out and hunt the coons and possums and stuff to make money by selling their hides, and that he never worried about it being dark because he just kind of felt the trails with his feet, walked with his feet. Really interesting skill when you think about it. Now, I feel like that about like the little areas right around my house that I could, not that I go out walking in the dark, but I feel confident that I could walk down my driveway and go to Paul's or go to Steve's or whatever in the dark, because my feet would kind of know and my mind would know. And even some of the trails, like this trail that leads out the ridge and goes down, I feel like I could follow that during the dark. Because kind of like he said, my feet would kind of know where it was at, even if it was like on a moonlit night. Of course, today we have flashlights and things like that. But interesting to think about how you become accustomed to that. Now, that's talking about being out in the woods and out in the country, about, out in nature. Those, definitely you learn by being out there and learn the trails and learn the, if it's a place you're familiar with, I'm talking about, not necessarily like I have no sense of direction, so it ain't like I could strike out through the woods and know that I was going to make a beeline for somewhere. I couldn't do that. Matt probably could, but I couldn't. But just talking about being familiar with trails and things like that. But it's interesting to me. Like that comes more natural to me because that's more of the landscape that I've lived in, the ones that I'm familiar with, I'm talking about. But interesting to me that people that do live in cities and more urban areas, then their mind works like that. So that makes sense to them about this block and this street and all that, and where I'm just like, what are you talking about? I can't understand anything you're saying. And reminded me of when Granny was in the hospital. It was a really big hospital. And she had to go one morning for a test, and the transport come to get her out of her room, and I all I had to do was follow. And I was following the gentleman that come to get her, and I thought, how would I ever know where I would never find my way back to where we were at, never. It just seemed like we went down the longest hallways pretty much I've ever seen in my life. I could just imagine riding a 10-speed bike down them, they were so long. And I was just like, my goodness, I'm glad somebody will have to take her back so I can follow them back, because I'd never figure it out. I was even thinking it'd be easier for me to go outside the building and just keep walking around the building until I realized, the door that I always go in. Anyway, but so when it was time for her to go back, transport didn't come and get her. It was a nurse there, and the nurse was not usually working in that area, she had told us, but she was that day. So she struck out and, was taking us back. I was just following her, and I didn't recognize any of it. It didn't look like what we had come, the way we'd come, but I thought, well, she knows more than I do. And so we go on up and down hallways on the elevator and all this, and we come into like more of a hospital ward, where there's going to be a nurse's station and all that. And she turns around and looks at me and she says, "This looks familiar, doesn't it?" And I said, "No, it doesn't, but maybe you're coming in a different way or something." And but right then one of the nurses kind of looked at her, and so she asked him, and he said, "Oh no, you're And he told her, you know, I just kind of stood there with Mom and I couldn't hear everything he was saying. So she come back over there and she said, I apologize. I've brought you to the wrong place. And she said, and I know this makes no sense whatsoever, but we have to go back to where we started from before I can, and then I'll find it. I said, okay, you know, what are you going to say? I said, okay. And so we went back to where we started from and went again. And in that time, it was more familiar. And then I thought, you know, I don't know if she's taking us right to the place or not, but she's taking us somewhere again. But she was right that time. She told me, she said, I know it makes no sense, but we got to go back to where we started from, but I do know where I'm going now. And I wondered if she did, because it's just such a massive hospital, but she did. That time she took us right to it. Interesting, though, those things, you know, as humans, our paths that we make and the areas that we travel, some people have, they become ingrained in you, I guess is what I'm saying. And Jesse thought that's what had happened to him and why he was so sure of himself in the snow. But there is some people, I tease about Matt's stepmother, Nana, that you could take her like to Alaska or somewhere, like, you know, or California, whatever, somebody's house, drive all the way there, and then 3 years later, she's like a homing pigeon. She could go right back to the same place. I couldn't do that, but she just has that uncanny ability to know exactly where to go and never forget it, never forget the directions, which is interesting. So anyway, that's why he thought he was so sure that he could make it and why he'd went out in the snow. Now one of the things I wonder is like the morning when he woke up after the sleeping in the fodder, I would have not cared about retracing my steps, which I guess he had to retrace part of them to get back on the turnpike there and go down towards Lansboro. But I would have just been in a hurry to get out of there. But he was curious. He thought, I want to know where I messed up. I want to know where I messed up. Well, he went back till he found where the gentleman he met in the wagon had told him not to bear too far to the left, but in the meantime, he had went too far the other way. Anyway, so he went back and found that. So I thought that was interesting because I would have just been trying to find the turnpike trail and get out of there and go get me something to eat and get warm. But then the most curious thing is, even in those days, it's so different. Like I was saying today, you know, if I did have to walk somewhere at night, I'd have a flashlight. Why did he not? I understand why he didn't carry a lantern or something like that, but why didn't he have matches? You think, Jesse, why didn't you have your own matches? Just 1 or 2 matches. You know, why didn't you have some matches? But he didn't. He didn't have them. So makes you wonder, did he learn after that? Like if he had ever went anywhere else, would he have just like made sure he had his matches? Matt has he has several bags because he likes to be in the outdoors, but even if we're just going a short distance, he usually has like he has a knife or something, his Leatherman or something, and he usually has at least a lighter. He has something, to make fire with. Again, different times that Jesse was living in, but it does make you wonder, why in the world didn't you have your own matches? Just at least 1 or 2 or something. Interesting that he found the corn fodder, the shocks of fodder there. My dad told me lots of stories about when he was a boy. That was part of the corn they grew in those days was not like the sweet corn, like the silver queen me and Matt are growing. It was more of a field corn that would dry well, so that then they could, in turn, they dried it and then they gathered it, and that way they could make meal out of it. They certainly enjoyed it fresh, but the majority of it was for being dried, so that then during the winter, they had cornmeal. But then they would also gather the shocks of fodder, and that fed their animals. That's what that was for. So they didn't waste any of the corn. Think about the corn stalk. Those shocks of fodder was the actual stalk that was left after you, took the corn, and either if it was dried or if you ate it fresh or whatever. And often they bundled them up like that, and then they left them in the field to ensure they just continued. You wanted them to be really, really dry, and in storage too, I guess. Maybe you wanted them there until your animals needed them, if you didn't have much, a big barn to keep them in or whatever. And doing them like that, the shocks of fodder, for one thing, they were already cut for your animals, but also it helped them weather, as far as the weather, helped them weather better. So it is really a miracle that Jesse wandered into that, so that, really smart of him to think, well, I could use this for protection, these shocks of fodder. Of course, he was really familiar with that. He'd done those kind of farming chores, gardening chores his whole life, so he was familiar with that. But interesting that he stumbled into it, and then that's ended up what saved his life, was knowing about those shocks of fodder. You do wonder, though, what the farmer, when he come by, what he thought, hey, what's happened here? Maybe he just thought, well, the wind and the snow probably did this. Maybe that's what he thought. Makes you wonder, though, if he could tell like somebody had been laying there or something. And by the time, though, he come to check on it, if the snow had melted, there'd probably be no sign, and he would just think that the wind had blew them over. And then interesting that he goes, you know, he makes a beeline there for the superintendent Anderson to talk to him about he wants he's so proud of his students there that he wants to, you know, he wants to put them up in competition against the other people all the way to the state, because he just really believes in them. Especially, of course, Budge Waters. He's, you know, such a character, and makes you wonder about how he was just that he really was probably just a genius. You know, there are people like that. So probably, definitely what he was. And neat, though, that Jesse, I think he wanted to do it probably for twofold reasons. He wanted those students to get to excel and to be out and to get the recognition they deserved, for here they were back in the middle of nowhere, and then they had still managed to learn and to gain all that knowledge and were striving so hard to better themselves. But then he also probably wanted a little bit of bragging rights, kind of like, look at my students, look at how great they are, look how good they are. And I would say that it probably really pleased him, because he had come up in such a rural area too. You know, when he was at Lonesome Valley, he said he knew about that school intimately, even though he had never been there, because he had been to a school like that. He'd been to one of those little small schools that was away from the larger schools, you know, back in the sticks, as we would say. So maybe that was a little bit of it too. So I hope you enjoyed this part, and seeing that Jesse survived. He survived the snowstorm. Really scary, though. I would not have wanted to have to spend the night out there, and with my pants, my breechy legs frozen, and my shoes and socks. And I think I've shared with you before, my biggest fear in life is rats and mice, so I wouldn't have liked the mice. He said he could hear them all night in the fodder. I sure wouldn't have liked that either. They probably thought, hey, this is great. This is, like, you know, we got a heater here. Jesse's keeping us warm. This big thing's keeping us warm. So I certainly wouldn't have liked that. Leave me a comment and let me know what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next.